Climate alarmists finally admit we were wrong about global warming. Welcome to the Shakaama Live Show with your host Shakaama. Here's a bit of news. And before I start this, James Delingpole of Breitbart News, the global man-made global warming alarmists, are already saying, "Nuh-uh." If that's how you want to say that, they're coming out against him and saying that his conclusions are wrong, false, unverified, so forth and so on. However, I'm going to read for you word for word what he says, and it's all based on actual publications in scientific journals that they have admitted this, and there is no conclusion that James Delingpole is making. It is the conclusions of the actual papers that have finally admitted that we were wrong. This is the inescapable conclusion of a landmark paper published in Nature Geoscience, which finally admits that the computer models have overstated the impact of carbon dioxide on climate, and that the planet is warming more slowly than predicted. Now, I have already given you a complete video talking about man-made global warming, and where they have said that we are headed for a small global cooling. So not only is it not warming, it is actually cooling, and it has been cooling. There was no warming for over 15 years. Now we're creeping up on 20 years now. So the models that they had used to predict this global climate change, man-made global warming, are ending their shelf life. You can't keep saying global warming when the actual models now are all false. The paper, entitled Emission Budgets and Pathways Consistent with Limiting Warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, concedes that it is now almost impossible that the doomsday predictions made in the last IPCC assessment report of 1.5 degrees Celsius warming above pre-industrial levels by 2022 will come true. It's impossible that it will occur. In order for that to happen, temperatures would have to rise by a massive 0.5 degrees Celsius in 5 years. Since global mean temperatures rarely rise even by as much as 0.25 degrees Celsius in a decade, that would mean the planet would have to do 20 years worth of extreme warming in the space of the next 5 years. This, the scientists admit, is next to impossible, which means their carbon budget, the amount of CO2 that say is needed to increase global warming by a certain degree, is wrong. This in turn means that the computer models they've been using to scare the world with tales of man-made climate doom are wrong too. One researcher from the alarmist side of the argument, not the skeptical one, has described the paper's conclusion as breathtaking in its implication. He's right. The scientists who've written this paper aren't climate skeptics. They're long-standing, warmist, implacable foes of climate skeptics. And they're also actually the people responsible for the production of the IPCC carbon budget. In other words, this represents the most massive climb down from the alarmist camp. But you certainly won't guess that from the way that the scientists are trying to spin their report. According to the London Times, Michael Grubb, professor of international energy and climate change at University College London, and one of the study's authors, admitted that his previous predictions had been wrong. He stated during the climate summit in Paris in December of 2015, all the evidence from the past 15 years leads to me to conclude that the actual delivering 1.5 degrees Celsius is simply incompatible with democracy. Speaking to the Times, he said, "When the facts change, I change my mind," as Keynes said. It's still likely to be very difficult to achieve these kinds of changes quickly enough, but we are in a better place than I thought. And also from the London Times, Myles Allen, professor of geosystem sciences at the University of Oxford and another author of the paper, said, We haven't seen that rapid acceleration in warming after 2000 that we see in the models. We haven't seen that in the observation. He said that the group of about a dozen computer models produced by government research institutes and universities around the world have been assembled a decade ago, so it's not that surprising that it's starting to divert a little bit from the observations. He said that too many of the models used were on the hot side, meaning they forecast too much warming. Note the disingenuousness here. Grubb is claiming that the facts have changed, which they haven't. Climate skeptics have been saying for years that the IPCC climate models have been running too hot. Indeed, the Global Warming Policy Foundation produced a paper stating this 3 years ago. Naturally, it was ignored by alarmists who have always sought to marginalize the GWPF as a denialist institution, which they claim erroneously is in the pay of sinister fossil fuel interest. Allen's, so it's not that surprising, is indeed true if you're on the skeptical side of the argument, but not if, like Allen, you're on those scientists who spent the last 20 years scorning, mocking, and vilifying all of those skeptics who for years have been arguing that the very point which Allen himself is now admitting is correct. That's why Benny Pizer of the Global Warming Policy Foundation says, this is a landmark moment in the history of great climate change scare. Quote, it's the first official confirmation we've had that CO2 is not a big driver of climate change, as the computer models have claimed, and it's the first official admission that the planet is not warming dangerously. Now, let me go a step further and tell you all of the research that I did that said that carbon dioxide is not a driver of warming. It is always a lagging indicator by sometimes 100 years. They go into the strata of the Earth's crust and they find periods of high CO2 emissions, and then they pair that with actual climate temperatures and find that by 100 years or even 1,000 years, you have a lagging indication of CO2 emissions. Now, CO2 in the atmosphere has nothing to do with man. CO2 in the atmosphere has everything to do with a very lush planet, ripe with all sorts of plant life, blooming and blossoming, and so forth. Now, what you don't know is that pre-industrial revolution temperatures were much higher than they are today. Let me reiterate, temperatures before man had machines were much higher than they are today. We are headed towards a global cooling period. But let's continue. But this is not, unfortunately, a cause for wild celebration in the street. Man Bear Pig has been scotched, but by no means slain. Nor are the alarmists yet ready to admit the full scale of their errors. This is not a little more than a damage limitation exercise by scamsters who know they've been caught cheating and have been forced to concede at least some territory to the opponents of their fear. Paul Homewood has their number. Number 1. We've known for several years that the climate models have been running far too hot. This rather belated admission is welcome, but a cynic would wonder why it's not made for Paris, before Paris. Meaning, they knew this before Paris, but they went ahead with the Paris Climate Accords, even though they already knew this, and now everybody's very alarmed that Trump is saying that he should get out of the United States is pulling out of the Paris Climate Accords. Number 2, I suspect part of the motivation to keep Paris on track, most observers, including even James Hansen, have realized that it's not worth the paper it is written on. This new study is designed to restore the belief that the original climate targets can be achieved via Paris and beyond. So they're still going to hold on to the belief that there is some sort of man-made global warming, which there is not. We are headed towards global cooling, which, according to the research that I looked at and the articles that I looked at, is far more sinister because it's going to hurt vegetation, which ultimately will hurt man. Number 3, although they talk of the differences between 0.9 degrees Celsius and 1.3 degrees Celsius, the significance is much greater, making the reasonable assumption that a significant part of the warming since the mid-19th century is natural. This means that any AGW signal is much less than previously thought. Number 4, given that they now admit they have got it so wrong, why should we be expected to have any faith at all in the models? Number 5, finally, we must remember that temperatures since 2000 have been artificially raised by the recent record El Nino and the ongoing warm phase of the AMO. Yup, but at least we climate skeptics have been proved right yet again. That's the main thing. Now, let's take a look at the sun, which went over a score sheet here. Scientists have changed their mind about the rate of climate change, saying the Earth is not heating up as rapidly as feared. Now, here's the answers to some key questions. What did they think before? In the past, climate change scientists did not think it was possible to reduce global temperature increases by 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels as demanded in 2016's Paris Agreement. Question: why has the expert opinion changed? A study in scientific journal Nature Geoscience says that the computer models used by the government to predict climate change exaggerated the impact of man-made emissions. Global temperatures since 2000 have not risen as much as the computer studies predicted. Now, let me explain that on 2 things. We have had nowhere near 0.5 degrees Celsius temperature change. We have had nowhere near 0.25 degrees Celsius temperature change. We are headed towards a global cooling. And for those people, we are now in the hurricane season, and it's named hurricane season for a reason. It's the season of hurricanes. For people living in Las Vegas, we've had a very mild summer. We had a very mild spring. It was so mild that summer really sort of creeped up on us. We didn't break any records this summer, and we're already in 80-degree weather. So it feels like 60. We're in 80-degree weather in the middle of the day, in the afternoon, which is the hottest time for temperatures in Las Vegas. Question: what difference will this make? If the world had followed the original predictions, only 70 billion tons of carbon could be emitted in total after 2015 if the planet was to be saved. But the new prediction suggests we can emit an extra 240 billion tons. This is good news for low-lying Pacific islands, which would have been flooded if temperatures rise above 1.5 degrees Celsius. Question: what are they saying now? One of the new studies authors, Oxford University Professor Myles Allen, said, "We haven't seen the rapid acceleration in warming after 10,000 that we see in the models. Many of the predictions were on the hot side," he added. Now, the skeptics, of course, are saying, we always knew this, and we have Lawson, who was ridiculed for his views on the global warming, and we had David Bellamy, who was criticized after he dared question the figures. And for those people who are still stuck on this global warming, man-made global warming, and saying that all scientists agree, this is a mantra that was 95% of the UN, United Nations, IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change are bureaucrats. They're ambassadors, they're secretaries, they're just bureaucrats. They have nothing to do with science and everything to do with government interests and lobbyists being included in these regulations that they were trying to impose on the world, of which China said no. I believe Russia said no. So there you go. China, the biggest polluter, quote unquote, biggest polluter, or the biggest producer of carbon, said absolutely not. They're not going to do that. And as well as they should. America and Europe, Western Europe, was not allowed, but already had their time where they went through their industrializations, and they put out tons and tons of carbon, and now they're already past all the industrial age, and they're now into the information age and the tech age. China is still in the industrial age, and they have to, of course, build their economy on that industrial part, as well as parts of Africa, which they are trying to stop. It seems like it's a concerted effort, really, to stop Africa from developing into the modern age. Now, for those of you who don't know anything about Africa, Africa is slowly bypassing the industrial age, going almost directly to the technology age, since they have stock exchanges, electronic stock exchanges, digital stock exchanges. They have cell phone towers popping up everywhere. It is sort of like China, the biggest market, the next biggest market for tech companies. Apple, Google are already there. Facebook already there. Facebook is trying to put drones over Africa to bypass cell towers and have internet connectivity on their drones. A hovering drone, big, huge drones. I already did a video on that too. Go look it up. Anyway, that's the conclusion of the new finding from Nat Geo. Thank you all for watching. Please like the video and share it with everybody.